A/ES10/L25 and to continue the debate after the action on draft resolution, and if the Assembly were to adopt the draft resolution later today, that the 10th emergency special session would be adjourned temporarily following the conclusion of the debate on item 5. Is there any objection to the motion? It is so decided. Before proceeding further, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution AES10L25 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution AES10/L25. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore also required for the adoption of any amendment to the draft resolution. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has the honor to take the floor on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, the member states of our Group of Friends have been following with grave concern the latest developments in the Middle East region, particularly the dramatic deterioration of the situation in the Gaza Strip and in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. In this context, allow us from the very outset to express our condolences to the families and loved ones of all innocent civilians who've lost their lives during the course of the past 20 days in this latest regrettable spiral of violence, death, and destruction. We also, as nations who love peace, we also, as nations that strictly abide by the norms of international law, we strongly condemn all violence and hostilities directed against civilians. In this regard, and in light of the continued deterioration of the situation on the ground, including as a result of the continuation of shelling and airstrikes, we stress the urgency of protecting civilians and averting the further loss of human life, particularly by bringing an immediate, durable, and fully respected halt to the indiscriminate attacks on civilians and ensuring that emergency humanitarian aid reaches the civilian population in need at this dire time. We stress that international humanitarian law must be upheld and fully complied with. Consequently, we urgently call for an immediate ceasefire and a halt to all acts of violence and hostilities, particularly those directed against civilians, including women and children, and civilian objects and infrastructure, including, among others, hospitals, schools, refugee shelters, and food warehouses. On the eve of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we call for the full respect of all human rights, particularly the right to life and health. We also call for restraint and thus urge an end to all inflammatory rhetoric and dehumanizing language, which in no way serves ongoing political and diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground, and quite to the contrary, only further stokes tensions and violence, while further endangering thousands of human lives, innocent lives. Mr. President, in line with a special communiqué issued by our group of friends on 17th of October, we'd like to seize this opportunity to renew our call on responsible members of the international community, particularly those who may have influence, as well as the Security Council of the United Nations, in pursuance of its duty to maintain international peace and security, as provided for in the Charter of the United Nations, to urge Israel to heed the latest calls of the Secretary General of the United Nations, to take the path of international legality, including by ensuring full compliance and adherence, among others, to the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, including its additional protocol, and all other relevant provisions of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We call on Israel to put an immediate end to the ongoing military aggression and the inhumane siege of the Gaza Strip in order to avoid a catastrophe and the total collapse of critical infrastructure, which will inevitably lead to more civilian casualties, widespread hunger, disease, poverty, and even greater human suffering and despair, thus further deepening the already dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We call on Israel to ensure the rapid and unhindered access and distribution of desperately needed humanitarian assistance, including crucial life-saving supplies such as fuel, food, medicines, and water. We call on Israel to allow UNRWA to operate safely and effectively without obstructions alongside other humanitarian actors on the ground, and to cease attacks on UN and other humanitarian and medical personnel. And lastly, we call on Israel to immediately abrogate its order for the civilian population to evacuate all areas in northern Gaza, as well as any other measure aimed at the forced transfer or mass displacement of the civilian population in Gaza. Mr. President, our group of friends regrets that the Security Council of the United Nations has been prevented from exercising its duties with regards to the maintenance of international peace and security, despite the repeated and collective call of both the Arab group and the international community as a whole for it to demand a comprehensive ceasefire, the protection of civilians, as well as fairness and justice in dealing with this dire situation. We trust, however, that this General Assembly will unequivocally fulfill its responsibilities under the Charter of the United Nations, including by adopting relevant measures aimed at redressing the current situation, particularly aimed at ensuring the protection of all civilians and the respect for other legal obligations, including those derived from international humanitarian law. We express in this context our strong support to draft resolution L.25 submitted by the delegation of Jordan as chair of the Arab group, and urge all responsible members of the international community to support this text strongly. Moreover, we'd like to seize this opportunity to once again call for the release of all civilians, as well as Palestinian prisoners and detainees, including children, and for the adoption of urgent measures aimed at ensuring, on one hand, the safety and well-being of all civilians, and on the other, the provision of international protection for the Palestinian civilian population in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, including on the basis of the recommendations made by the Secretary General of the United Nations in his report from 2018, as well as of the provisions of Security Council 904. Similarly, we also express our grave concern about the escalating violence and attacks against the Palestinian civilian population in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We demand a halt to the systematic violence, human rights violations, provocations, and incitement, as well as to all settlement activities and annexation measures, and to all other breaches of the historic and legal status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem. These grave violations must end. And at this stage, we cannot overemphasize that this should be a top priority, that any further dangerous destabilization of the situation must be prevented, including as part of efforts to prevent a spillover effect into the entire Middle East region. Mr. President, in line with our principled and historic position, we reaffirm our commitment to the cause of Palestine, a fellow member from our group of friends and its people in their just and legitimate struggle to achieve their inalienable rights, including the self-determination, freedom, the return of Palestinian refugees, and justice. We emphasize in this context the importance, as never before, of creating a credible political horizon for the realization of a just and lasting solution to the question of Palestine in all its aspects, including for the plight of the Palestinian refugees in full accordance with international law, the relevant UN resolutions, and the Charter of the United Nations. We stress, furthermore, the urgency of efforts in this regard, and they should be aimed at putting into practice the overwhelming international consensus on the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. Moreover, we stress that a lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be achieved by peaceful means, and call for an urgent effort to address the root causes of this protracted and tragic conflict, to ensure accountability, and to promote and support meaningful efforts to achieve a just, lasting, and comprehensive solution. To conclude, we reaffirm our full commitment to preserving, promoting, and defending the prevalence and validity of the Charter of the United Nations, a historical treaty that constitutes a true act of faith in the best of humanity, and which to date, although under attack and persistent threats, keeps us all bound, among others, to our promise of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and to ensuring respect for the dignity and worth of the human person. Let us act, therefore, without further ado, collectively and responsibly, to uphold our solemn duties under the UN Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
The distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jamaica.
Mr. President, the attacks on Israeli civilians by Hamas on October 7 were abhorrent. They were acts of terror that must never be condoned. Ordinary Israeli citizens, men, women, and children, were murdered, wounded, abducted, and assaulted. Some 200 plus people, including citizens of other states and nationalities, were taken hostage. This is unacceptable. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and an end to the use of these terrorist tactics. CARICOM notes that Israel's response to the attacks has been devastating to ordinary Palestinians in Gaza. Over 4,600 lives have been lost, more than 14,000 people have been wounded, and approximately 1.4 million have been displaced. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is worsening daily, with women and children being disproportionately impacted. This unacceptable level of human suffering cannot go unabated. CARICOM therefore joins the call for an immediate cessation of hostilities by all parties, the opening of humanitarian corridors to facilitate unhindered access to food, medical supplies, fuel, water, and other humanitarian products and services so desperately needed by the affected civilian population. We commend the Secretary General for his relentless efforts in coordinating the delivery of humanitarian assistance and supplies to those affected. We also commend the work of UN staff and affiliated personnel who are working tirelessly to provide support to the affected population. We also acknowledge the role of members of the United Nations that are actively deploying resources and facilitating access to amenities aimed at alleviating the suffering of the civilian population. CARICOM conveys its deepest condolences to the families of Israelis and Palestinians who have lost loved ones. We also empathize with the families of the UN staff members who have been killed. CARICOM also extends its sympathies to those injured during this tragic conflict and pray for their speedy recovery. Mr. President, CARICOM expresses its concern that if the conflict is not immediately brought to an end, it could escalate into a wider regional conflict with significant implications for the stability and welfare, not just of that region, but also of the broader international community, with devastating consequences, especially for vulnerable small island states such as those in CARICOM, who are already struggling to overcome multifaceted challenges. CARICOM therefore calls on all stakeholders to take every necessary step to re-establish a pathway to peace and stability through dialogue and diplomacy, and to reject any methodology that includes violence, war, and terror. The ordinary people of the region, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, all deserve to live in peace and harmony, free from the pernicious threats and constant fear of violence and terror. Let us once and for all acknowledge and accept the utter futility of war, violence, and terror, and recognize that dialogue and diplomacy constitute the only viable pathway to a lasting peace. Mr. President, please allow me to close by reaffirming CARICOM's continued support for UN Security Council Resolution 242 and the ongoing efforts of the United Nations towards a two-state solution, which is the best way to achieve comprehensive peace, security, and tranquility between Israel and Palestine. CARICOM urges the acceleration of these efforts to bring about an urgent, peaceful, and lasting resolution to the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jamaica, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Oman, speaking on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council, to take the floor.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may the peace, mercy and blessings of God be upon you. I deliver this statement on behalf of the Member States of the Gulf Cooperation Council, namely the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the State of Qatar, the State of Kuwait, and my country, the Sultanate of Oman. We meet today at this emergency special session, unfortunately, as the Security Council has been unable for days to take a united stance on what is transpiring in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially the Gaza Strip, and on the aggression by Israeli occupation forces against innocent civilians. This is a cause for concern for us all and must be condemned by the international community. A siege, starvation, collective punishment, cutting off water and electricity supplies, denial of the delivery of the most basic necessities of life. The GCC condemns violence in the Gaza Strip and calls upon the international community to stand resolutely against it, as this violence is inconsistent with international law and international humanitarian law. It is running roughshod over the principles of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which compel Israel, the occupying power, to protect civilians in times of war. Mr. President, the United Nations indicates that more than 6,500 Palestinian citizens in Gaza have been martyred so far, among them 2,300 children and 1,200 women, and a number of international staff working for UNRWA. Not to mention the number of the injured and those sustaining serious injuries. Those are more than 17,000. What is happening today in the Gaza Strip is unacceptable, but it will not deter the Palestinian people from demanding its legitimate, inalienable rights, chief among them the right to self-determination and the right to establish an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Palestinian people decided, just as other peoples that suffered from occupation, decided to end occupation. The reality is clear to us all and nothing will change it. Palestine, in the eyes of the international community and according to Security Council resolutions, is occupied land. We are therefore surprised and outraged by those who are applauding or are describing occupation and deem it to be an act of self-defense. Self-defense does not happen on occupied, usurped land. Mr. President, the GCC countries agree with the Secretary General of the United Nations that what's happening today in the Gaza Strip did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people has been subjected to a stifling occupation for 56 years. Its land has been swallowed by illegal settlements. Neither the Palestinian people nor any peace-loving nation of the world would accept the occupation of land by force. The Palestinian people will not accept any option that is not based on ending the occupation, liquidating colonialism, and the exercise by the Palestinian people to its inalienable rights, just as any other people of the world. I would like to stress that the GCC countries have full confidence in the Secretary General of the United Nations. We support his efforts to consolidate the principles of the UN Charter, international law and international humanitarian law. We support his call to stability and security. We express our condolences over the passing of UN staff who became victims of the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. The GCC countries stand with international law, international humanitarian law, and international legitimacy, represented by the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the ICJ. We support the Arab Peace Initiative. We support a just and comprehensive peace that lays the foundation for a new chapter of peaceful coexistence and security for all peoples in the Middle East. A peace that ends decades of killing, of violence, persecution and systematic violation. Against the above, the GCC countries calls upon all member states to vote for the draft resolution tabled by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and to work on an immediate ceasefire, ensure the urgent delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza, including food, water, fuel and medication without any obstacles, to stop the siege, the Israeli siege on Gaza and resume supply of electricity and water, and to refrain from any plans to forcibly displace the civilian population. I thank you.
Give the floor. I thank the distinguished representative of Oman, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Mr. President, we thank you for the resumption of the 10th Special Emergency Session of the General Assembly. We align ourselves with the statement delivered on behalf of the Arab Group, the OIC, and the statement on behalf of the GCC member states. Mr. President, we all realize that the resumption of this special emergency session comes at a critical time and context. The deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip as a result of the Israeli attacks against innocent civilians have become catastrophic. They threaten to spiral in a manner that will threaten the security of the region and the world. In this manner, we express deep regret over the failure of the Security Council to undertake its responsibilities in accordance with the Charter. The Council failed to adopt any outcome, neither to adopt a resolution for an immediate ceasefire or a binding resolution regarding the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip. As such, it is important for the General Assembly to undertake its responsibility in safeguarding international peace and security, according to the Charter and its Resolution 377, Roman 5, titled Uniting for Peace. We renew our call for all parties for de-escalation and ultimately working for the full ceasefire, the immediate release of all prisoners, particularly civilians, ensure delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza Strip, opening safe corridors that allow the delivery of humanitarian aid. We reaffirm again our condemnation of all forms of targeting civilians, particularly women and children, our unequivocal rejection of the siege, the full siege imposed by Israel, the occupying power, on Gaza Strip that deprives 2.3 million people, half of whom are children, of their basic needs, including water, food, medicine and electricity. This comes at a time when the Israeli bombing has killed more than 6,000 victims in Gaza Strip, including more than 1,700 women and more than 3,000 children. We reaffirm our unequivocal rejection of the policies of collective punishment and the efforts and attempts of forcible displacement of Palestinian people from Gaza Strip and forcing civilians to internally displace or take refuge in neighboring countries, which is a violation of international law. In light of this catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip, and in addition to all the diplomatic and humanitarian and mediation efforts that Qatar is undertaking, we also take pride in adopting and presenting this draft resolution submitted by the Arab Group titled Protection of Palestinian Civilian Population. Mr. President, the draft resolution represents the minimum obligations of member states in such circumstances that they should undertake to address the grave repercussions of the situation in Gaza Strip. It addresses a critical vacuum in terms of the situation in Gaza Strip, a vacuum created by the failure of the Security Council to perform its legal and ethical responsibilities. Mr. President, it is very important for the General Assembly, through this draft resolution, provide a legal framework of reference needed for the international response to the situation in Gaza. This should also, the support for this draft resolution should reflect the consensus and unity of the international community towards the fair nature of the Palestinian question, and through the wide support for this draft resolution, send a message of hope to our brothers, our Palestinian brothers, that the General Assembly is united to restore respect for international law, for the Charter. We reaffirm that the only guarantee to achieve sustainable peace in the region is to reach a fair and comprehensive solution for the Palestinian question in accordance to the Arab Peace Initiative and the two-state solution that guarantees the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with its capital East Jerusalem, and for the Palestinian people to enjoy their inalienable rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, Qatar continues to contribute to the ongoing diplomatic efforts to find a way out that will stop the bloodshed of our Palestinian brothers and ensure a sustainable political solution in accordance to the well-known terms of reference, and steer the region away from spiraling into chaos and violence. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Qatar, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Egypt to take the floor.
Your Excellency Dennis Francis, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for convening this 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly to consider the tragic situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially after repeated efforts to adopt a Security Council resolution have faltered for reasons known to all. Mr. President, it is very easy to deliver a standard statement in which we warn of the grave repercussions of the current crisis, in which we condemn the unjust Israeli aggression on Gaza, in which we address the brutality of this aggression and its violation of international law and human values, in which we call once again for protecting the Palestinian people and ensuring the delivery of humanitarian aid. Mr. President, it is difficult, though, to have to repeat all of the above in all the fora that discussed the crisis, starting with the Cairo Peace Summit, at which the President of the Republic hosted a number of world leaders in an attempt to overcome this crisis, followed by the open debates at the Security Council on the Middle East 2 days ago, and then bilateral meetings with all influential international actors that communicated with Egypt. We repeat these points, although we are convinced, Mr. President, that the truth is clear and wouldn't need any repetition or explanation or elaboration if we all applied one standard rather than double standards. It is one standard known to us all, Mr. President. No to targeting civilians, no to terrorism, no to violating international humanitarian law, no to bombarding hospitals and medical centers, no to killing children, no to the siege, and no to cutting off all basic necessities of life, no to forcible displacement and liquidating the rights of people, no to genocide. All people are equal. We made the difficult choice, Mr. President, of dedicating ourselves to getting a clear position out of the General Assembly regarding what is transpiring in the Palestinian territories, the crimes, the violations, so that we would not be, as the Arab proverb goes, a mute devil that does not speak out for the truth. At a time where so many are turning a blind eye to the truth. Silence is no longer an option. Enough is enough. We can no longer bear what is happening to the Palestinians. The required stance is clear and simple. It is no more than reaffirming the most basic human values, the most basic principles of international law, the most basic political and diplomatic norms in armed conflict. In this context, we would like to stress the following points. First, it is obvious that when the situation explodes, the UN would work on ensuring a ceasefire. Not because it is biased towards one party over the other, not because it supports terrorism, but because it is important to stop the bloodshed, to prevent any further escalation, to show that the United Nations is able to fulfill its role in preserving the most basic right in the Human Rights Declaration, the right to life. The right that was forgotten by those who pay lip service to human rights. We have heard justifications by those who want this war to continue that make them complicit in the violations unfolding before us. A ceasefire. Is this really so hard? Second, the policies of besieging, starvation, denial of basic necessities, food and medication, including water. Water, ladies and gentlemen, these policies have no place in the 21st century. They are reminiscent of practices of the Middle Ages. The General Assembly must send a clear, unequivocal message. These necessities must be delivered to Gaza without any conditions. Denial of humanitarian aid under these circumstances is a death sentence for the people of Gaza. Humanitarian aid delivered within a robust, orderly mechanism under the supervision of the United Nations. Is this really so hard? Third, any attempt to forcibly displace the Palestinian people within its territories or to neighboring countries for the third time in its history, citing protection as a reason or any other reason. Any such attempts must be confronted resolutely and rejected categorically. We must refer here to statements made by some politicians in this very hall at a similar emergency special session, lamenting rights that might be lost, while now we see them show understanding for or even acquiescence of forcibly displacing Palestinians to neighboring countries. Why not? They are used to ignoring this people, ignoring its cause for centuries, ignoring its rights and the rights of the people of the region until we reach the absolute bottom. No to the forcible displacement. Is this really so hard? Fourth, the Palestinian leadership has insisted time and again on providing protection, international protection to its people that is languishing under the yoke of occupation, especially in light of repeated violations by armed settler militias. But these calls have fell on deaf ears. We cannot help but call once again before you all for providing this protection in the hope that this would awaken the conscience of those that are lamenting the loss of human rights of all people except for the Palestinian peoples. To those rights, they turn their backs. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the proponents of killing women and children, proponents of the siege, the forcible displacement, and other proponents of the war, they claim that this war aims to counter terrorism and uprooting terrorism, but the reality is that failing to take effective and immediate measures to stop this war would inevitably fuel terrorism. It would push generations of young people towards extremist ideologies. The reality is also that not stopping this war now, before it's too late, would push the whole region towards a devastating regional war that will affect the interests of those who are stalling in calling for its end, more than the interests of other countries. The reality is also that failure to come out of this crisis with a clear vision to revive the peace process, revive a serious peace process that addressed the roots of the current crisis and that would lead to the two-state solution, would be a grave mistake with long-term repercussions. Future generations will hold us accountable for our inaction and our myopia. Ladies and gentlemen, Egypt, as a leading country, the leading country in consolidating peace in the Middle East, will continue its tireless efforts to ensure a ceasefire, to protect civilians, to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid. It will continue to mediate, to release hostages and the captives and prisoners. It will continue to work on creating a conducive environment to revive the peace process that is the only way to achieve peace and stability in the Middle East. Considering all of the above, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I call upon you to support the draft resolution under consideration today and to vote in favor for this resolution, to achieve justice, to apply one standard, aiming only at stopping the killing, at maintaining peace and security, at protecting civilians. We hope that this position would be a nucleus to achieving peace in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, stop this absurdity, stop this war immediately, stand on the side of truth and justice, vote in favor of this resolution, save the peace. Is this really so hard? I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt and now invite the distinguished representative of New Zealand to take the floor.
President, New Zealand welcomes the convening of this General Assembly emergency special session. We regret the UN Security Council has been unable to perform its responsibility to act on behalf of all member states. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us all as members of the General Assembly to exercise our collective political responsibility under the UN Charter to address matters of international peace and security. President, even as this meeting convenes, the conflict in Israel and Palestine escalates. The humanitarian crisis worsens and civilian lives continue to be needlessly lost. It is intolerable to see civilians, many of whom are children and infants, continue to suffer disproportionately as innocent victims of this conflict. As I said in the Security Council a few days ago, New Zealand condemns absolutely Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel. We are appalled by their brutality, their targeting of civilians, and the taking of hostages. These are clear violations of international law. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We support Israel's right to defend itself in full compliance with international law, including in respect of actions taken in Gaza. Ultimately, though, no military solution will bring about a just and lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians. The protection of civilians and delivery of humanitarian assistance is the most urgent priority. New Zealand joins calls for a humanitarian pause and humanitarian corridors to enable unhindered and sustained assistance and protection, in line with humanitarian principles, to those who desperately need it. We recognise the bravery of humanitarian workers who are working tirelessly in extraordinarily difficult circumstances to provide such needed assistance. We are deeply saddened that so many have been killed in the line of duty since the despicable events of 7 October. When New Zealand last served on the UN Security Council in 2015-2016, we championed Resolution 2286, which demands greater protection for healthcare in armed conflict, including hospitals and medical personnel. Healthcare facilities must never be used for military purposes or be the object of attack. We are deeply concerned to see hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons. Their safety and security must be protected. We call for the establishment of designated safe areas that are strictly off limits as targets or for military use. We expect Israel and Hamas to act in accordance with international humanitarian law, which imposes obligations upon all parties engaged in armed conflict. The Palestinian people must not suffer for the atrocities of Hamas, even as Hamas exploits those same civilians as human shields. Israel also has an obligation under international humanitarian law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, to provide basic needs for civilians in Gaza, including food, water, energy and shelter, and to facilitate humanitarian aid. New Zealand urges all parties, including Israel and Egypt, to continue to facilitate access for the delivery of urgent humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. As the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator has observed, seeing more aid and supplies entering Gaza is another glimmer of hope for the millions of people in dire need of humanitarian aid. At the same time, they need more, much more. For our part, New Zealand is supporting humanitarian appeals for populations in Gaza, the West Bank and Israel. We stand ready to increase our support in the coming weeks. This is not a time for political posturing or for using this conflict to advance any cause except bringing peace and security to Israel, Gaza, and the wider region. It is a time for de-escalation. Finally, New Zealand remains committed to a two-state solution which envisions an independent state of Palestine living in peace and security alongside the State of Israel. A new political horizon is essential. We call on the international community to take urgent action to advance the Middle East peace process. Without it, the armed conflict may eventually cease, but there will be no winners. We will never be free from the violence, the loss of innocent lives, the anti-Semitism, the Islamophobia that has erupted in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, and around the world since 7 October. As the Secretary-General has said, we cannot lose sight of the only realistic foundation for a true peace and stability, a two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, distinguished delegates, it is my honor to address this meeting in the name of a country, Cambodia, that not so long ago was consumed by decades of war, the killing fields where those labeled the oppressed and the oppressor were devoured by the intense flame of hatred, vengeance, and extremism that fed the most heinous crimes against humanity. My delegation mourns the loss of so many innocent human lives, including one Cambodian since October 7 until now, and also earlier, both in the state of Palestine and the state of Israel. The Palestine-Israel conflict is very complex and delicate issue. Therefore, Cambodia wishes to make its own principled position in this regard instead of joining the statement made by any group. Cambodia condemns all acts of terrorism and violence against innocent civilians, regardless of their race, culture, or religion. We are deeply concerned by the escalation of violence, continued suffering and loss of innocent human lives, women, children, babies, and the elderly on the lands of the present conflict. Hatred, vengeance, feed another cycle of hatred and vengeance. A war cannot end a war and bring lasting peace and harmonious coexistence. My delegation feels the fire of anger, the pain and the agony of all, and we can only appeal and hope for the sense of moderation to prevail. Now more than ever, it is of paramount importance to address the root causes of the Palestine-Israel conflict, to enable both peoples of Israel and Palestine to coexist side by side in harmony. Mr. President, allow me to reiterate 3 points which I raised during the recent open debate of the Security Council. First, it is heartbroken to see the increasing number of civilian casualties and the pain they endure. My delegation urges all parties to exercise utmost restraint, abide by the international humanitarian law, and constructively engage in dialogues to de-escalate the worsening situation, achieve a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause. It's not easy, but we must make utmost efforts to avoid the widening of the war and fully appreciate the concerns and legitimate aspiration of all equally so as to end the cycle of violence. Second, civilian lives and safety must be protected from harm in conflicts. My delegation urges for the release of all civilians taken hostage. We call on all sides not to target civilian or civilian infrastructure and to allow unimpeded humanitarian access for the delivery of essential aid such as food, water, medicine to those in need, in accordance to international humanitarian law. Third, we call the international community to unite in a spirit of genuine solidarity and sincerity, to foster a meaningful dialogue and negotiation leading to a just and lasting peace. Please stop finger pointing. Please give peace a chance. Please allow love for humanity to prevail for all the people on earth, regardless of their race or faith. Please empower the forces of moderation to allow the people of Israel and Palestine to live side by side in lasting peace, security, and harmony. Again, my delegation salutes the dedication and sacrifice of the UN staff and those of humanitarian agencies who brave formidable risk and danger to provide relief to the innocent civilian. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, I begin my statement today by expressing Liechtenstein's grave condolences to all those affected by the violence both in Israel and Palestine since the attack by Hamas on Israel on October the 7th. In the face of the ongoing escalation on the ground, we are concerned that despite concerted efforts, the Security Council has as yet been unable to discharge its primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security. For those grieving and suffering in Israel and Palestine today, but also for our public back home, Its silence is incomprehensible. We welcome the leadership of Secretary General Guterres and his personal engagement for the protection of civilians, but the political organs of our organization must not remain silent in a situation where civilians have been victimized at a large scale and remain in a very precarious situation in Gaza. We therefore welcome the opportunity to meet in the format of emergency special session today, including to consider the special report transmitted from the Council in the wake of the veto cast last week, as well as the one we understand will be transmitted as a result of the further double veto. We encourage you, Mr. President, as you have done before in meetings resulting from the use of a veto, to produce a summary of this meeting for transmission to the Council. Mr. President, Liechtenstein condemns in the strongest possible terms the heinous terrorist attacks against Israel by Hamas and other groups and the massive violations of international humanitarian law they have committed, including mass killings, torture, abduction and hostage-taking, and the threat of killing hostages. We join the call for the unconditional and immediate release of all hostages and express our gratitude to those who have contributed to the release of the first hostages. The firing of rockets from Gaza on civilian targets and the deliberate targeting of civilians are grave violations of international humanitarian law, amounting to war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. Liechtenstein deplores the massive loss of life. We affirm Israel's right to defend itself and to protect its population in accordance with international law. We also underline the need for the full respect of international humanitarian law in this massive crisis of protection of civilians, in particular the principles of distinction and proportionality. Any collective response to Hamas's atrocity crimes must place the protection of civilians and respect for international humanitarian law at its center. The disturbing number of civilian casualties, many of them children, in Gaza are unacceptable. Mr. President, the ongoing investigation of the International Criminal Court into the situation in the state of Palestine has to be an important part of our discussion. Where international humanitarian law is violated at a large scale, accountability is essential. For almost a decade, the court has had jurisdiction over international crimes committed on the territory of the state of Palestine, as well as those committed by Palestinian nationals. This investigation has gained an even increased sense of urgency since October the 7th, particularly the need for clarity concerning some of the most disturbing incidents, such as the explosion at the Al-Ahli hospital, which has resulted in massive casualties, the exact number of which yet remains to be determined. We expect concrete action and pronouncements from the ICC prosecutor. Mr. President, the people of Israel and of Palestine have been brought to this point by a cycle of military retaliation and revenge. Civilians have been paying the price in hurt, grief, and loss for failed policies of those in power and effective control. Their suffering has reached unprecedented heights in the past weeks, and it must be stopped as soon as possible. A diplomatic solution will be the only way to achieve this goal. We must begin by addressing the immediate humanitarian needs of Palestinians and to work for the unconditional release of all hostages. We support the calls for humanitarian pauses that allow for the full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. The government of Liechtenstein has decided yesterday to contribute 100,000 Swiss francs to the International Committee of the Red Cross to support its activities, to protect civilians and to provide humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, in response to the horrors of the Second World War, the Charter of the United Nations included in its purposes, I quote, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights, and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace." End of quote. Liechtenstein reaffirms the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, which is the only way to ensure the rights and to deliver on the aspiration of the Palestinian people, a vision of two states living side by side in peace and security within internationally recognized borders. We commit again to a peace guided by the purposes of this organization. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland. The floor is yours. I instead give the floor now to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would have been pleased to allow my Irish colleague to go before me. Colleagues, we meet at a perilous moment for Israelis and Palestinians first and foremost, but also for the region and the world. The death, destruction, and desperation playing out before our eyes is enough to make one lose faith in humanity. How could Hamas carry out such barbaric acts of terror? How could Hamas gun down civilians, burn families alive, and execute children, and do so with glee? How could Hamas take more than 200 people hostage? Innocent civilians, including a 9-month-old baby and his 4-year-old brother. How could Hamas justify taking a 23-year-old American citizen, Hirsch, whose parents I met this week? And the answer is they cannot. There's no justification for terror, none whatsoever. You all know that, and we must condemn Hamas's acts of terror. Hamas's goals are single-minded and they're sickening. They're determined to destroy Israel and kill Jews. And let's be clear, Hamas has never cared about the genuine needs or concerns or safety of the people it claims to represent. And Hamas has no respect for the rule of law or human life. To them, Palestinian civilians are expendable. To them, Palestinian civilians are human shields, and it really is despicable and it's cowardly. The lives of innocent Palestinians must be protected. The lives of UN personnel and humanitarian workers and journalists must be protected. And we mourn the loss of every single innocent life in this crisis, every single one. We must not look away, and we must not become numb to the pain and the suffering of people like Wa El-Dadou, a Palestinian journalist whose wife, son, daughter, and grandson were killed in Gaza this week. And my heart breaks for a while. My heart breaks for all of the innocent civilians who are caught up in this crisis. Colleagues, the United States has made clear in both public and private conversations that as Israel exercises its right, and indeed its responsibility, to defend its people against a terrorist group, it must do so in line with the rules of war. There are no law-free zones in war. International humanitarian law must be respected throughout Gaza and the region by all actors. President Biden and Secretary Blinken, in partnership with the UN and regional actors, are engaged in direct diplomacy to help protect the lives of all civilians and to ensure humanitarian assistance can flow into Gaza. As humanitarian organizations have stressed, the needs of Palestinians in Gaza are dire. So many families lack access to food, clean water, and other essentials, and hospitals need fuel to keep patients alive. This is a humanitarian emergency, and we're doing everything in our power to save lives. The United States is the single largest donor to the Palestinian people, having contributed more than $1 billion to UNRWA since 2021. And last week, President Biden announced an additional $100 million in humanitarian assistance for the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. While in the region, President Biden also secured an agreement with Israel, Egypt, and the United Nations that allowed aid to start reaching Gaza. But much more needs to be done. Much, much more is needed, and it's needed urgently. We continue to encourage Israel, Egypt, and all partners to take concrete steps to alleviate this humanitarian crisis, just as we continue to urge and encourage all member states, particularly those with the greatest capacity to give, to help us meet the UN's appeal for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Colleagues, time is of the essence, and lives hang in the balance. As you'll notice, two key words are missing in the resolution before us. The first is Hamas. It is outrageous that this resolution fails to name the perpetrators of the October 7th terrorist attack. Hamas. Hamas. It is outrageous. Another key word missing in this resolution is hostage. This resolution makes no mention of the innocent people, including citizens of many of you in this room, many of you here today who have citizens who are being held hostage by Hamas and other terrorist groups. These are omissions of evil, and they give cover to and they empower Hamas's brutality. And no member state should allow that to happen. You should not let it stand. And that is why we have co-sponsored an amendment put forward by Canada that corrects these glaring omissions. This amendment is straightforward and it's unobjectionable. It calls on us to condemn Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th, and it calls for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. It should be easy. This is the bare minimum that we would hope to see in this resolution. We urge all member states to vote yes on this amendment. The General Assembly must send a clear message to the world that we stand against all acts of terror and that we stand with all those who are being held hostage. We believe the UN Security Council, a body charged with maintaining international peace and security, must send this same message. And that's why this week we put forward a Security Council resolution that garnered the support of the majority of the Council. In drafting this text, we solicited input from all Council members, including Russia and China. And the product of our consultations was a balanced and strong resolution that, among other things, condemned Hamas's terrorist attacks, called for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, stressed the urgency of addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, including through humanitarian pauses, and made clear that we must keep the hope of a two-state solution alive. Again, this was a strong and balanced text, but unfortunately, Russia and China decided to veto this resolution. And while the United States worked to forge consensus around a balanced product, Russia has put forward bad faith, one-sided resolutions without any consultations whatsoever. Colleagues, one-sided resolutions, whether they are put forward in the Security Council or the General Assembly, will not help to advance peace, not when they ignore the facts on the ground. One-sided resolutions are purely rhetorical documents that seek to divide us at a time when we should all be coming together, and we must not cling to long-standing lines of division. As President Biden said yesterday, there's no going back to the status quo as it stood on October 6th. We must not go back to the status quo where Hamas terrorizes Israel and uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. And we must not go back to a status quo where extremist settlers can attack and terrorize Palestinians in the West Bank. The status quo is untenable and it is unacceptable. This means that when this crisis is over, there has to be a vision of what comes next. In our view, that vision must be centered around a two-state solution. Getting there will require concerted efforts by all of us, Israelis, Palestinians, regional partners, and global leaders, to put us on a path for peace, to integrate Israel with the region while insisting that the aspirations of the Palestinian people to be part of a more hopeful future. We deeply regret that the resolution now under consideration is detrimental to this vision. But while this resolution is deeply flawed and does not meet this moment, the United States will continue to work with all member states to chart a future where Israelis and Palestinians have equal measures of security, freedom, justice, opportunity, and dignity, and a future where Palestinians realize their legitimate right to self-determination and a state of their own. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, at the outset, allow me to thank you for convening this crucial debate under the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. I also want to express my thanks to the Secretary-General and commend his leadership and personal commitment to the protection of civilians, access of vital humanitarian aid to Gaza, and the resolution of the conflict. President, Ireland unreservedly condemns the heinous and barbaric acts by Hamas on the 7th of October. The deliberate taking of hostages, including women, children and the elderly, is simply unconscionable. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. In the face of such appalling attacks, Israel has the right to defend itself, but must comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law. We stress the applicability of international humanitarian law to all armed conflict. This includes the prohibition on the target hostages and the use of human shields. These are obligations that bind all parties to armed conflict, state and non-state actors alike. Earlier this week, we heard yet another deeply concerning briefing from Special Coordinator Wennesland on the situation on the ground. We are also highly troubled about the impact of recent events on regional stability and call on all regional and international actors to act responsibly. President, we are gravely concerned about the situation in Gaza and the particular impact of the conflict on children. We renew our call on Israel to end the blockade of Gaza and to allow meaningful humanitarian access, especially of fuel, to enable hospitals and relief organisations to function. Civilians in Gaza must have access to basic necessities: water, medicine, food and fuel. There must be rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access for the benefit of civilians in the Gaza Strip. Ireland again echoes the Secretary-General's call for a humanitarian ceasefire or a humanitarian pause to ensure that the humanitarian needs of the population can be comprehensively met. We offer our deepest condolences to the families of the UNRWA staff who have lost their lives during this conflict, and we commend UNRWA and all of the UN and humanitarian personnel on the ground for their selfless work in support of the people of Gaza and across the Middle East. In response to the unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe now unfolding in the Gaza Strip, Ireland has announced an immediate package of €13 million last week, €10 million for UNRWA and €3 million for UN OCHA's Palestine Humanitarian Fund. We urge other partners to also step up and support this vital work. We are also highly concerned at the serious increase in violence in the West Bank, including further forced displacement of Palestinian communities. President, colleagues, a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in the Middle East may seem further away than ever. However, we must all work towards this end. Lasting peace can only be based on an enduring commitment to mutual recognition, freedom from violence, incitement and terror, and a two-state solution. We reaffirm our support for these principles here today. Ireland's position on how to achieve this is long-standing and based on respect for international law and the agreed international parameters. The two-state solution that ends the occupation, that meets Israeli and Palestinian security needs and Palestinian aspirations for statehood and sovereignty based on the 1967 borders, and with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, offers the only prospect for sustainable peace. Ireland has consistently opposed all uses of the veto in the Security Council, and we will continue to do so. We welcome these General Assembly debates as a means of calling the permanent members to account when they prevent the Council from taking action in defence of international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
The distinguished representative of Ireland for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Mr. President, Singapore welcomes the convening of this emergency special session of the General Assembly. We are disappointed that the Security Council, which has met on several occasions to discuss this issue, was not able to agree on a prompt and united response. Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to express Singapore's utmost support for the efforts of the UN Secretary-General to sustain the flow of humanitarian assistance to the civilians affected by this terrible tragedy in Gaza. We commend the Secretary-General for his leadership role in facilitating the flow of humanitarian assistance and recognize the important contribution made by UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations on the ground. We support all efforts to diffuse tensions in order to avoid an escalation of the conflict. Mr. President, respect for the UN Charter and for international law has always been a fundamental guiding principle of Singapore's foreign policy. The UN Charter and international law provide the foundation for international peace and security. On the 7th of October, Hamas carried out a major coordinated terrorist attack on Israel, deliberately targeting civilians, murdering and kidnapping them, and perpetrating abhorrent acts of terror. We mourn the loss and suffering of so many innocent civilians, including children and the elderly. This attack cannot be condoned or justified by any rationale. We condemn this terrorist attack in the strongest possible terms, and we also call for the immediate and safe release of all hostages taken by Hamas. In this regard, it is worth recalling that just in June this year, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the global counterterrorism strategy. This calls for the international community to reiterate its strong and unequivocal condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, committed by whomever, wherever, and for whatever purposes. Mr. President, under international law, Israel has the legitimate right to defend its citizens and its territory. However, Israel also has an obligation to comply with the international humanitarian law. All parties must abide by international humanitarian law and do their utmost to protect the safety and security of civilians. We welcome all efforts to establish and uphold safe zones and routes that will keep civilians out of harm's way and allow for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, Singapore is deeply saddened by the dire humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and by the loss of so many civilian lives. This is a massive humanitarian crisis. We urge all parties involved to allow the rapid, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid and essential services to the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. The Singapore government has made a financial contribution to support humanitarian relief operations through the Singapore Red Cross, and many Singaporeans have also made their own contribution to the relief operations, and it is our hope that their contributions will reach those in need quickly. Mr. President, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a long-standing one, and it must be resolved in accordance with international law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. This is the only way to stop the repeated cycles of violence. Singapore's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been consistent. We continue to hold the view that the only viable path to a durable, just and comprehensive solution is a negotiated two-state solution, consistent with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We support the right of the Palestinian people to a homeland and Israel's right to live within secure borders. Both Palestinians and Israelis deserve to live in peace, security, and dignity. We call on leaders from both sides to show leadership, to exercise restraint, and to take the difficult but necessary steps towards the vision of a two-state solution. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU and its 27 member states, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino. Mr. President, colleagues, first to you, Mr. President, I want to thank you for convening this emergency special session, as the situation is deeply alarming for so many people, and it risks spiraling out of control throughout the region. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the UN and all its personnel for their relentless work on the ground, often at the risk of their lives, as well as the tireless efforts of our Secretary General. Mr. President, we regret that the use of vetoes has prevented the Security Council's efforts from addressing the situation and from fulfilling its mandate and responsibility. This dramatic conflict and the humanitarian situation would have required a united, timely and strong message by the Council, which the latter failed to deliver. This is deeply regrettable. We know that efforts are still underway to have an outcome at the Council, and we encourage Council members to find that common position soon. The EU's position is well known. The EU reiterates our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of Hamas for its brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel. The use of civilians as human shields by Hamas is a particularly deplorable atrocity. The EU strongly emphasizes Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law and international humanitarian law. We reiterate our call on Hamas to immediately release all hostages without any preconditions. The EU reiterates the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times in line with international humanitarian law. It deplores all loss of civilian life. We express our gravest concern for the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza, and we call for continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary measures, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. We will work closely with partners in the region to protect civilians, provide assistance and facilitate access to food, water, medical care, fuel and shelter, ensuring, of course, that such assistance is not abused by terrorist organizations. We recall the need to avoid regional escalation and to engage with partners in this respect, including, of course, with the Palestinian Authority. The EU is ready to contribute to reviving a political process on the basis of the two-state solution, including through the Peace Day effort, and welcomes diplomatic peace and security initiatives and supports the holding of an international peace conference soon. We stress the need to fight dissemination of disinformation and illegal content and highlights the legal responsibility of the platforms in this context. We understand the rationale to have a resolution at the UN General Assembly in the absence of one at the Security Council, and we have engaged constructively and we have proposed amendments. The priorities and positions that I have outlined here, in addition to the points we made over the last weeks, will guide our approach to the draft resolution put forward. The purpose of the UN is to overcome divisions. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Mr. President, we align ourselves with the statement delivered by Mauritania on behalf of the OIC member states, Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, and Oman on behalf of GCC member states. Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you for the resumption of the 10th Special Emergency Session of the General Assembly, a session that is convening in the light of the catastrophic conditions and circumstances faced by the Palestinian people as a result of this military disproportionate bloody campaign against them by Israeli occupation forces. In light of these critical and painful conditions, and following the dangerous developments in Gaza Strip, thousands of civilians, children, women, and elderly are killed. Hospitals, schools, shelters, and infrastructure are bombed. This does not create only a humanitarian catastrophe, but have also dire consequences and repercussions to the security of the region and the world. We have clearly condemned the targeting of civilians by any party. We called for a ceasefire, stop the bloodshed, lift and immediate lift of the siege, the release of hostages, provide humanitarian assistance and support to those affected. We also condemn the attempts at forcible displacement and policies of collective punishment against the population in Gaza, including the starvation of civilians as a weapon of war, the prevention of access and delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians, or depriving them of their basic needs, life-saving basic needs. We reaffirm that our priority is to work for peace and call for compliance with international conventions and laws. The current crisis is a result of the failure of the international community to end the occupation and implement the two-state solution. Silence in the face of illegitimate Israeli practices, whether over the past 70 years or even recently, is what led the region to the current crisis. We warn again of the possibility of a spillover of this conflict in a manner that would threaten all the peoples in the region and international peace and security. Mr. President, in light of the siege, the killing and the displacement and the failure of the international community up till this date to call for a ceasefire and allow the entry of necessary humanitarian aid, we express discontent regarding the double standards and the selectivity in addressing this crisis, and we express our deep regret regarding this hesitation to support the right of the Palestinian people to live a dignified life or to condemn the current humanitarian tragedy that they are living under. Mr. President, safeguarding international peace and security is at the heart of the work of this organization. Today we see that the organization fails to undertake its important role with all the delays in finding a solution that addresses this crisis, and in light of the ongoing Israeli violations of international conventions, including the international humanitarian law. This undermines trust and confidence in international mechanisms and the credibility of those who defend them. This will adversely impact our capacity to safeguard international peace and security. To achieve justice and a balance should not be done through looking at things from one perspective. And here I would like to reiterate what the UN Secretary General mentioned, that it is important to acknowledge that those attacks did not come from nowhere, were not a result of a vacuum. The Palestinian people had suffered from a strangulating occupation for 56 years. The time has come for the organization to undertake and perform its responsibilities for which it was established, for the international community to take a firm and serious position to end the killing of defenseless civilians, lift the siege, and ensure the prompt entry of humanitarian and relief and aid in terms of food, water, and medicine to prevent further exacerbation of the tragedy and prevent the spillover of the conflict, undermining the international and regional security. Mr. President, we are making all efforts in communication with brotherly and friendly countries to find an effective and practical and prompt solution that will stop the bloodshed and put an end to this escalation and an end to the ongoing and escalating cycles of violence in the region. We work for a better future for our region. We look forward for it to enjoy peace, stability and development, and we reiterate our demand to push the peace process forward in accordance with Security Council resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative that aim at finding a just and comprehensive solution, the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital in a manner that would realize peace, stability and prosperity for all. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call on Member States to co-sponsor and support the draft resolution submitted today, which seeks to serve the best interest of international peace and security. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Excellent President, Excellencies, we have convened here today as we collectively grieve for the thousands of Israeli and Palestinian civilians who have lost their lives since 7th October. This is one of the darkest and most volatile periods that the Middle East has seen in recent years. Hamas's heinous and terrorist crimes of 7th October, as well as the indiscriminate rocket fire on civilians in Israel, which we condemn in the strongest possible terms, will resonate for generations, manifested as trauma, anguish, anger, and heartbreak. Many Israelis are still living the nightmare of knowing that their loved ones continue to suffer. Terror has no justification, and we must be clear in rejecting it. Hamas must immediately and unconditionally release all hostages. Israel has the right to self-defense in line with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, necessity, and proportionality. On the other hand, on the other side of Gaza's wall, it is not only hostages who are suffering. Millions of Palestinian civilians are under siege with extremely limited access to water, food, fuel, electricity, medicine, or shelter, if any. In conformity with international law, all parties are obliged to ensure that civilians are protected. We must urgently and genuinely address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Malta continues to strongly call for the establishment of a humanitarian ceasefire or pauses and humanitarian corridors. People must be allowed to bury their dead. Hospitals need fuel and anesthesia. Over 2 million people require sustenance. Sustained provision of life-saving services is paramount. The protection of humanitarian facilities, such as hospitals and designated safe zones, and the unimpeded access for humanitarian and UN personnel, including aid convoys, is also critical. We are devastated to learn that 35 UNRWA humanitarians have lost their lives in Gaza. We commend the agency for its heroic work these past weeks. As diplomats, we urgently need to do our job to allow them the ability to keep doing theirs. Malta welcomes current efforts towards allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza through Rafah and commends all partners involved. However, we note the current volume of aid is limited and needs to be adequately scaled up. This crisis is also having a devastating impact on women and children. Ensuring that humanitarian supplies are gender responsive and that women are involved in distribution is essential for meeting the needs of women and girls who are at higher risk of gender-based violence and psychological trauma. President, the conflict has reawakened tangible risks of regional fissures and increased further uncertainty in an already turbulent world. We must collectively unite to mitigate any risks or miscalculations which may lead this conflict to spill over into the West Bank or into the broader Middle East region. We call for all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate, and respect the norms of international law. In view of such urgent necessities and risks, Malta is now closely working together with the elected members of the Security Council on a text that we hope can garner consensus and address the situation on the ground. Palestinians have, for far too long, dreamt of a reality which embraces their legitimate aspirations, which isn't choked by decades of occupation, violence, and displacement, a reality which ensures the dignity of their children. Israelis too deserve to live in peace and security without being held hostage by terror. To this end, Malta remains committed to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East, a peace which is based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. We therefore urge all member states to support the draft resolution which is before us today. Peace is not optional and demands to be steered by a recognition of our common humanity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta for her statement and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this resumed 10th emergency session of the General Assembly in response to the request of the Arab and OIC groups. Mr. President, we are witnessing a human tragedy of epic proportions unfold in front of our eyes. Israel's campaign of bombardment and airstrikes that has now continued for 20 days has killed 7,000 helpless Palestinians, half of them children, and wounded 17,000 others. Entire families and neighborhoods have been wiped out. The Palestinians are being bombed indiscriminately and without mercy or compunction. Their essential lifelines, water, food, fuel, have been cut off. Over 1 million Palestinians are internally displaced in Gaza. And even those who are displaced cannot hide from the Israeli bombs which rain upon them. 40% of Gaza City has been destroyed. And yet, the Israeli onslaught continues. It has also spread, almost without note, to the West Bank. 37 staff members of the UN Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, in Palestine have tragically lost their lives, many with their families and their homes gone. 40 UNRWA buildings and warehouses have been damaged by Israeli airstrikes. As noted by one UN official working in Palestine, in Gaza, the largest open-air prison in the world, it has today become the graveyard of a population trapped between war, siege, and deprivation. Mr. President, Pakistan strongly and unequivocally condemns Israeli airstrikes and the systematic and barbaric crimes against the Palestinians, particularly the attacks on schools and residential buildings and even hospitals, such as the Ali Baptist Hospital, where hundreds of sick and injured civilians, men, women, and children, were killed. These Israeli attacks on civilians, civilian objects, and infrastructure, blockade of water, food, and fuel, as well as the forced transfer of people from the occupied territory, are flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Indeed, Mr. President, what we are witnessing on our television screens, what the people of Palestine in Gaza are suffering, may amount to a veritable genocide. As our Secretary General has warned, and as we can all perceive, the situation, I quote, is growing more dire by the hour, unquote. The war, quote, risks spiraling throughout the region, unquote. In this moment, the Secretary General has said, it is vital to be clear on principles, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians, unquote. Mr. President, we are repelled by the crude and disrespectful Israeli response to the Secretary General's circumspect and valid views. The General Assembly should collectively reject these insulting remarks and reaffirm our full confidence in the Secretary General. Mr. President, as human beings, we must be appalled at the magnitude of the suffering of the helpless Palestinian civilians, especially the children and women. I am sure all of us are also appalled at the vicious and callous way that the Palestinians are being slaughtered by cowardly aerial bombardment and long-range artillery. They are being crucified, not by a militant organization, but by a government which claims to be democratic. And we must also be appalled by those who, by blocking the call for a ceasefire in the Security Council, have enabled the continuation of the Israeli slaughter of innocents. It is the hope of the Arab and OIC countries that the General Assembly, acting under the Uniting for Peace process, will succeed where the Security Council has failed. The co-sponsors of the draft resolution in document EA/ES 10/L25 seek three objectives. One, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The Israeli killing machine must be stopped in Gaza and the West Bank. Two, the flow of sufficient and sustained humanitarian assistance into Gaza to preserve lives and prevent further suffering of innocent Palestinians. And three, to ensure that the Palestinian population of Gaza is not further displaced within or outside Gaza. Mr. President, it is shocking that even these largely humanitarian objectives, set out in the most circumspect language, have been opposed by some in the General Assembly. Even the call for a ceasefire has faced objections. This position is unjustifiable, legally and morally. Furthermore, an amendment has been moved to insert condemnatory language that is one-sided, discriminatory, and legally contentious. If equity is to be served, we would need to insert language to reflect the realities of this war in a balanced and clear manner. One, to reaffirm the right of the Palestinian people under international law to struggle by all possible means, including armed struggle, to secure their freedom from foreign occupation and exercise their right to self-determination. And two, to strongly and unequivocally condemn Israel's barbarous and indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian civilians and protected objects and sites in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Without such balancing language, we will vote resolutely against the one-sided Canadian amendment. Mr. President, in the context of this war, consideration should also be given to some form of an accountability mechanism. The crimes that are being committed cannot go unpunished. We have several recent precedents of accountability mechanisms from which to choose. And finally, for the future, we need to consider ways to prevent a recurrence of this slaughter. The OIC foreign ministers have proposed the deployment of a protection force to safeguard Palestinian civilians in the Gaza and perhaps also in the West Bank. We should give serious consideration to this. Mr. President, it is only once this war is brought to an end, once the killing stops, that we can turn to find a durable solution. The resolution which we have presented seeks to do just that, to stop the killing, to stop the war, and turn back to find a durable political solution. I urge all member states to vote for our resolution. I urge them all to vote against the one-sided Canadian amendment. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand welcomes the convening of this 10th emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly today because of the urgency of the situation and plight of all affected civilians. Thailand is deeply concerned over the escalation of hostilities and violence in the Middle East caused by the unprecedented developments in Israel and Gaza. The heightened hostilities and the scale and scope of violence have claimed thousands of innocent lives, with many more injured and displaced. These include children, women, the elderly, and the sick. The massive and escalating use of force have destroyed their livelihoods and communities. Thailand is profoundly shocked and deeply saddened by the attack on Al-Ahli Arab Hospital in the north of Gaza, resulting in loss of life of innocent civilians and casualties. To alleviate the suffering by civilians, we oppose the withholding of access to basic necessities such as water, food, electricity, and fuel as weapons of war. Now, such access should be restored. We also oppose the targeting of critical civilian infrastructure. This should cease. Thailand offers our deepest condolences to everyone who lost their lives and their bereaved families. Our deepest sympathies are extended to all those who are suffering. No family should have to face such tragedy. No family should have to feel such anguish. No family should have to mourn such loss of loved ones. We are also victims. Thai nationals have been killed and injured. We are deeply concerned for the safety of Thai nationals as well as those captured and held hostage. We strongly appeal for their immediate release and safe return. This has been echoed by the ASEAN foreign ministers in their statement of 20th October. We thus welcome the references in the draft resolution calling for their immediate and unconditional release. Thailand condemns in the strongest terms all forms of violence and attacks on civilians in conflict situations, including capturing and taking them hostage. Thailand urges all sides to respect and fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure the safety and dignity of civilians in conflict situations. The protection of innocent lives and civilians must be a priority at all times. This should be our calling at this critical juncture. This should be our unifying catalyst as we seek to alleviate the suffering. As the situation escalates, the most urgent concern is for all civilians who have been affected. Unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance must be ensured. We welcome efforts by various parties to ensure such access to humanitarian assistance, and in this connection we welcome the initial humanitarian relief that has recently entered into Gaza and hope that this will be increased in the days ahead. Many lives are at stake. Many more are at risk. We appeal to the international community to continue to mobilize humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza to ensure that they have access to basic necessities, including safe and clean water, food, and medical care. Thailand joins others in the call for all sides to take immediate steps to prevent the escalation of violence and implement an immediate ceasefire. We appeal all sides to seek all avenues to resolve the current situation and work towards a long-term peace through diplomacy. Thailand will continue to support the United Nations and the international community in any way we can to de-escalate the situation. We reaffirm our support for genuine dialogue with a view to finding a mutually agreed peaceful solution to the issue in accordance with the two-state solution, by which the states of Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders consistent with relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. Let us do our utmost to save lives and to bring those captured and held hostage home. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam is participating in this emergency special session with a heavy heart and with great concern on the escalated situation in the Middle East. It is regrettable that the Security Council has been unable to take action on this urgent matter. We urge the Council to continue to work together to address the situation immediately. We also hope that the Council and the UN at large can send a unified and constructive message aimed at de-escalating tensions, ending hostilities, protecting civilians, and promoting dialogue and negotiations. Mr. President, my home country is not unfamiliar with disproportionate casualties and the destruction of critical infrastructure in situations of conflict. This takes an incredibly heavy toll, not only on human life, but also on socio-economic foundations that impede development for decades. Vietnam, therefore, once and again condemns in the strongest terms all indiscriminate attacks targeted at civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. They must be protected under international law, especially in compliance with international humanitarian law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I'd like to express our deep sympathy and condolences to the families of all civilians who lost their lives, including UN workers, in the recent flare-ups of conflict starting on October 7th and continuous events thereafter. If history can tell us anything, it is innocent civilians who bear the brunt of armed conflicts. All human life is precious, irrespective of race, religions, or gender. This is why all acts of hostilities and violence must end immediately in order to stop further suffering and bloodshed. Hostages must be safely released at once and without conditions. We strongly urge all parties to refrain from the use of force and exercise utmost restraint. Violence only incites more violence. There is a lot of work to be done. We call for urgent provisions, especially by the UN, of rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian assistance. Water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity must reach those in serious need. We urge all concerned parties to make every effort to facilitate this. Vietnam welcomes and commends all international mediation and reconciliation efforts towards a peaceful, just, and lasting resolution to this conflict, which must be based on international law and relevant resolutions of the United Nations. Durable peace can only be achieved through a comprehensive solution. It is our consistent position to support the two-step solution for the establishment of an independent state of Palestine that coexists in peace with the state of Israel based on the pre-1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as its capital. Vietnam calls upon all concerned parties to work towards an environment that is conducive to the cessation of hostilities, the escalation of tensions, and the return to peace talks and negotiations. All of us must actively contribute to that end. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Austria aligns itself with the statement of the European Union held earlier. At the outset, let me once again emphasize that Austria condemns the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians on 7 October in the strongest possible terms. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality. There is no justification for terror. Israel has the inherent right to defend itself in the face of such violent and indiscriminate attacks in line with international humanitarian law. We call for an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages abducted by Hamas and other terrorist organizations. Our joint priority must now be to prevent a regional escalation of violence and hostilities, and we welcome efforts of all partners in this regard. We call on all regional actors to refrain from any action that adds further fuel to the fire. Colleagues, let's be clear. It was the barbaric terror attack by Hamas that brought unbearable suffering on innocent people. It is Hamas that puts the civilian population in Gaza in harm's way, including by using them as human shields. By purposefully directing its resources and urgently needed fuel to its rocket launchers instead of to desalination plants and hospitals, Hamas also bears responsibility for the humanitarian hardships of the civilians in Gaza. Colleagues, international humanitarian law must be respected at all times. It is crucial to ensure the protection of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, and to allow humanitarian access to deliver food, water, and medicine to Gaza. We express our concern at the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and reiterate the importance of the provision of urgent humanitarian aid and ensure that it is not abused by terrorist organizations. We support the call for safe, full, and unimpeded access throughout Gaza and a sustained effort to deliver vital life-saving assistance to the population. We welcome the recent humanitarian deliveries via the Rafah crossing point and thank all actors involved, including Egypt, the United States, the United Nations, and Israel, in facilitating these deliveries. Mr. President, both Israelis and Palestinians have the right to live in peace and security. We should not allow anyone to undermine the positive dynamic that led to a normalization of relations between several Arab countries and Israel. But it has come more than clear who is not interested in any sort of peace: Hamas and other terror organizations. They have no future to offer to the Palestinian people. Genuine peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike can only be achieved through a political solution. For us, the goal is clear. We need a negotiated, two-state solution allowing Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security. Our guiding principle is and will remain international law. Mr. President, let me briefly turn to another aspect of this debate. One reason for gathering in the GA today is that several vetoes prevented the Security Council from adopting a resolution. As we have said at other occasions, the veto right of the permanent members should not paralyze the Security Council from discharging its duties. We therefore welcome that we've had the opportunity to have this discussion here today. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this emergency special session. For 3 weeks now, unspeakable scenes of human suffering continue to unfold in Gaza. Millions of civilians are under indiscriminate bombing. They are deprived of water, food, electricity, and fuel, collectively punished under a complete siege. There can be no justification for the indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. These acts of collective punishment and attempts at forced displacement of people are unacceptable and have to be stopped. We must be unequivocal in condemning and opposing loss of each and every innocent life. There is an urgent need for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Uninterrupted humanitarian access to and within Gaza is also an absolute necessity. In this connection, we commend the efforts of the Secretary General and relevant UN agencies on the ground. Mr. President, under these dire circumstances, international community has to come up with a unified position to make these imperatives happen. It is the responsibility of the United Nations to help achieve this unity and deliver results. in terms of maintaining international peace and security. However, this has not been possible until now due to the paralysis of the Security Council. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the General Assembly to rise to the occasion and do its utmost to make UN system function. It is in this understanding that as Turkey we co-sponsored the draft resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations, and call all member states to support this resolution. It includes the bare minimum requirements to stop the carnage and help de-escalate the situation on the ground. Mr. President, we must prevent this conflict from spiraling out of control and spilling over other areas. Sustained security cannot be achieved by targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. No peace is possible or sustainable as long as the Palestinian aspirations for freedom, dignity, and statehood continue to be oppressed. A just and comprehensive settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be realized through a peace process based on two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tunisia welcomes the convening of this 10th emergency special session on the question of Palestine, and we support the statement delivered by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, as well as a statement delivered by the distinguished representative of Mauritania on behalf of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, and we wish to deliver the following remarks in our national capacity. After the failure by the Security Council on a number of occasions to adopt a resolution to end the aggression and genocide perpetrated by the occupying forces against the Palestinian people over the past 3 weeks, what has resulted in 7,000 martyrs up until this point, we hope that the international community will be able to take this emergency session and to meet its historic and moral responsibility and to uphold justice, law, and the values upon which this organization was established, as well as human rights, peace, and security. While we condemn categorically the war crimes perpetrated by the occupying power against Palestinian civilians and the systematic targeting of women, children, families with targeted attacks, targeting hospitals and emergency personnel, holy sites being targeted, as well as with policies which are geared towards halting essential services. These are being used as means of war. We cannot allow the international community to remain silent and for the failure of international institutions and bodies. First and foremost, the Security Council, their failure to uphold their responsibility. What does the international community expect in terms of action? What is the international community is waiting to act? How many Palestinian civilians need to die for the international community to honor its moral and humanitarian responsibility? as well as its legal responsibility, which requires for an immediate ceasefire. As we have stated on a number of occasions, we reject the double standards, the selectivity when it comes to international law, and we call for an end to manipulation for the distorted realities and attempts to justify crimes. We urge the Secretary General to continue efforts to achieve a ceasefire and to deliver humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And we reject the attacks against the Secretary General. Mr. President, we find ourselves at a critical juncture. We are bearing witness to a genocide and the forced eviction of the residents of Gaza from their territory, as well as practices of blockade and unprecedented violations of their right. This is carried out in the eyes of the world, and this is carried out in a manner that is in contempt for all international bodies. Even in the international community, the United Nations and institutions fail to intervene today. They will not rise to the magnitude of this crisis if they fail to stop these heinous crimes against humanity, and if they fail to deliver uninterrupted, unselective humanitarian assistance, if they fail to stop the evictions of Palestinian people, then there will be no achievement of justice. The international community will then have agreed to find itself hostage to egregious violations of international humanitarian law, human rights, and all the principles and values upon which the United Nations was founded. Mr. President, Tunisia takes great care to uphold the principles of justice and law. We reject any forms of injustice and aggression. We reiterate our support for the fraternal Palestinian people, and we call for an end to war crimes being perpetrated by the occupying forces. And we call for respect for rights. We reject the equivalence between the occupying aggressor and the aggressed, and we reject the attempts to advance erroneous ideas about the rights to self-defense to justify genocide. Justice is clear, and the rights of the Palestinian people need to be inviolable and upheld. We hope that the General Assembly will adopt a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire to end further bloodletting, to deliver protection to the Palestinian people, and to prevent attempts to evict people by force while delivering humanitarian and medical assistance in an ongoing way to the Gaza Strip. In this regard, we call on member states to support the draft resolution tabled by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to end this humanitarian tragedy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil welcomes the reconvening of the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly after the failure by the Security Council to adopt any of 4 draft resolutions on the situation in Israel and Palestine. One of them was proposed by Brazil and not adopted due to the veto of 1 permanent member, despite having received 12 votes in favor, 4/5 of the Council membership. We worked tirelessly in an inclusive and constructive manner with diligence and sense of duty with all delegations willing to engage with our proposal. Our goal was that of presenting a text that carried a resolute and united response by the Security Council. We did not shy away from the negotiations and deliberations on the proposals that were put forward by other members of the Security Council. We still believe that our first draft could have been the best possible outcome of the Council when we presented it. The robust support given by Council members to the resolution, for which we are very grateful, indicates that it was a balanced text, It was solidly rooted in international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and fundamentally committed to the humanitarian imperative. Such imperative demands that we be clear and firm in our condemnation of all violence against all civilians, Israelis, Palestinians, or otherwise. This is why my delegation expressed and now reiterates Brazil's unequivocal condemnation of the heinous terrorist acts by Hamas, including the taking of hostages. This is also why we clearly condemn the attacks that are indiscriminately killing and wounding civilians and destroying civilian objects in the Gaza Strip, and the deprivation of its civilian population of means indispensable for their survival. It is again the humanitarian imperative and international humanitarian law that indicate what must be done. All hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Continuous, sufficient and unhindered provision of essential goods and services to civilians throughout the Gaza Strip, including but not limited to water, food, medical supplies, fuel and electricity, must be secured. It is also urgent to guarantee full, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. Mechanisms such as humanitarian pauses and corridors must be swiftly established to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid. A cessation of hostilities is urgently needed so that conditions be created for a complete, durable and respected ceasefire. Our collective response to this crisis, which we all fear will only aggravate if nothing is done, will be a watershed moment for the United Nations. It will be a testament to the effectiveness of multilateralism or its further weakening. It will show whether the United Nations can be serious about preventing, stopping, or at least mitigating the horrors of war. This Assembly and the Security Council must act decisively. The world is watching us, and this is not rhetoric. The world is truly watching us and expects an effective response. Brazil will continue to work tirelessly as President and then as a regular member of the Security Council to make its voice heard loud and clear on this heartbreaking conflict. And when the immediate crisis is overcome, we all must redouble efforts to address the root causes of the tragedy unfolding before our eyes. Mere conflict management has failed. It is the recipe for continued violence and permanent instability. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Of God, the merciful, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you for having agreed to the request to hold the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly concerning the issue of Palestine. We support the statement made by the representative of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on behalf of the Arab Group and Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. Mr. President, the catastrophic situation of the Palestinian people due to the military actions and the barbaric crimes committed by the occupation forces, and in view of the blockade and the lack of provision of basic necessities, and blockade forces us, members of the United Nations, in conformity with the purposes and principles of the Charter, to fulfill our collective responsibility to put an end to the crimes, massacres, and continued destruction of residential neighborhoods with their residents and infrastructure and services. After all these crimes, how can you explain the silence? How can you interpret the failure to take any binding measures to stop these crimes? What can we say about the continuation of massacres and genocide by the occupation forces without any kind of deterrence? Is that an encouragement for the Israeli occupation forces to continue these crimes under the false pretext? Mr. President, we are witnessing a historic turning point within the United Nations, which was created to build and achieve international peace and security. Indeed, the Security Council for the past 3 weeks has failed to fulfill its legal responsibility and to adopt necessary measures to maintain international peace and security and to protect civilians and to stop the bloodletting, that is, by stopping military activity, or to open border crossing points to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We note with regret that the organization is incapable of upholding its principles. For decades, this organization has not been able to resolve the Palestinian issue. Mr. President, this extraordinary session is taking place due to the continuation of Israeli attacks for the past 3 weeks against the Palestinian people, brethren people, in particular in the Gaza Strip. This is a systematic genocide, the imposition of a blockade and forced expulsion. These are crimes that continue, a litany of crimes for the past 70 years in front of the very eyes of the international community and the Security Council. This is a flagrant violation of international law and international humanitarian law, of the Charter and of international treaties. Today, as the diplomatic process underway in the Security Council has confirmed that this council is not in a position to fulfill its moral, legal, and humanitarian responsibilities with regard to maintaining international peace and security and put an end to these barbaric actions and violations against the Palestinian Palestinian people. We find ourselves in the midst of a diplomatic process of the international community that we represent here at this emergency session. We're far from this being selective as far as humanitarian issues and issues of destiny. We must force the occupation forces we must impose a ceasefire, open crossing points, and ensure the delivery of assistance and completely lift the blockade, stop expulsions, and ensure exchange of prisoners, and ensure the reconstruction following the destruction that has been caused by the occupying forces. This is the tribune to which oppressed people turn to, and we have a collective responsibility to free them from this injustice and grant them the right to life. Many of the images that we're seeing are horrific. Innocent people, women, and children. These images will remain etched in our memories, as will the position of the Security Council in the history of this organization. Lastly, we would like to reiterate our support for the Palestinian people to fulfill their aspirations and legitimate rights that are inviolable, including their right to self-determination, right to return, and the creation of their state on Palestine with Jerusalem as capital. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmed, the Minister for the Middle East, North Africa, and the United Nations. The floor is yours, Lord Tariq.
Thank you, Mr. President. Of condolences for the 30 UNRWA staff and the 16 medical staff who have lost their lives since the 7th of October. Equally, we record our sincere condolences to the victims and the families of the horrendous Hamas terrorist attacks on the 7th of October on Israel. And equally, we extend our condolences to the families of the innocent Palestinians who have been killed in this tragic conflict. Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi rajiun. To God we belong, to God we return. Your Excellencies, Mr. President, every life that is lost is a tragedy, not just for a family in Israel or Gaza or the West Bank, but it is a loss for all of humanity. An Israeli life or a Palestinian life, irrespective of being Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. Every life matters. Every life lost is a tragedy. Therefore, as we recall the tragic consequences of what we are witnessing, we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law. Yes, this means the unconditional release of the hostages and taking every possible step to avoid the harming of civilians and, importantly, enabling unhindered humanitarian access. We all know, it has been said from this podium countless times during this debate, that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is growing. On our part, the United Kingdom has provided an additional $37 million to help provide water, to help provide food and medicine and fuel in Gaza. And in this regard, may we put on record our thanks to the tireless work of the Secretary General and the United Nations to ensure this life-saving aid reaches those most in need. Whilst we welcome the important first step of 54 trucks passing through Rafah border crossing, we urge the scaling up of this assistance, including to enable fuel for civilian use to pass into Gaza, vital to keep hospitals and the humanitarian response running. And these humanitarian pauses are an important part of ensuring that this can happen. Turning to the attacks on Israel on the 7th of October, my Prime Minister has been clear. The United Kingdom stands with Israel in the face of Hamas terrorist attacks. We will always support an ally against a terrorist attack and its right to self-defense. But this must be, I assure you, Mr. President, and we make that case, it must be within international humanitarian law. And if I may just put also, from a personal perspective, as a Muslim, terrorism is evil. Every terror act is against humanity, and we should condemn it unequivocally. So, Mr. President, the draft resolution in front of us could have been clearer on this very point. It should also, in our view, unequivocally condemn these terror attacks, Hamas's terror attacks, that killed over 1,400 people, and, as we know, at this very time, hold over 200 hostages. However, we have equally been clear that all possible precautions and steps are taken to minimize harm to civilians in this conflict, and indeed for any movement of civilians to be both voluntary and safe. Mr. President, we stand at a crucial juncture. Yet, in this moment of darkness, let us come together, this United Nations, that we come together and not lose sight of the promise that this United Nations holds true of a two-state solution, a secure, safe Israel, side by side with a viable Palestinian state. And I assure you of this, that we, the United Kingdom, will continue to work closely with all partners in the region and beyond in these efforts, because peace must prevail, and to prevent the situation from spreading and causing wider insecurity and instability. It was my Prime Minister who said, "Hope and humanity must win against the scourge of aggression and terrorism. Love over hate, light over darkness. Peace, shalom, salam. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, Lord Ahmed, for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Mr. President, Peru would like to express its deepest condolences to the families of the victims, independently of their nationality or religion, and would like to express our unconditional solidarity with the populations affected by the devastating conflict in the Middle East. This conflict has lasted decades without a solution, and that on the 7th of October has seen a new and grave escalation in hostilities. We find ourselves meeting in pursuant to the resolution titled Uniting for Peace that states that if the Security Council, due to a lack of unanimity among its permanent members, ceases to fulfill its primary responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. In this context, the General Assembly will immediately consider the matter with a view to addressing appropriate recommendations to the Member States in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. End of quote. This did indeed occur in connection with various draft resolutions in the Security Council that were not approved. Mr. President, just a few weeks ago during the general debate, my country addressed member states with a very clear message. Peru promotes peace, and to achieve this peace it is necessary to apply the United Nations Charter in all circumstances. And while the Charter contemplates the right to a veto in its Article 24.2 states that the Security Council, in fulfilling its functions, must proceed in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations and in conformity and in accordance with Article 1.3. Its purposes include resolving international problems of a humanitarian character. Consequently, based on a teleological reading and systematic reading of the Charter that Peru has promoted, the veto should not be used as a way of negatively impacting compliance with the purposes of the organization. The current impasse that we find in the Council is extremely concerning. We feel consternation when this is taking place while humankind is observing with stupor the continuing fighting and spilling of blood that has affected thousands of innocent people. As representatives of our nations, we have a responsibility in favor of peace and international security, and we have an obligation to look inside ourselves and to ask ourselves, what are we really doing to remedy this veritable tragedy? Are we fulfilling our duties, or are we ignoring these inexcusably? Are we seeking to reach agreements or blaming each other? The heavy burden of finding answers to these questions obviously is even greater in the case of states that have direct commitment in favor of a lasting and just solution. Last week, the Security Council had a clear and viable solution to take concrete action. The draft resolution presented by Brazil, which reflected in a balanced way the various perspectives and obtained 12 votes. However, one permanent member decided to use their right to a veto, and it would seem that we're still far from a consensus. In these circumstances, Peru reaffirms that we must seek consensus based on the following elements. First of all, to establish a ceasefire strive for humanitarian aims. Secondly, the firm and unconditional condemnation of all acts of terrorism and acts of violence and hostilities against civilians. Thirdly, unequivocal rejection and condemnation of the horrific terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October, as well as the taking of hostages. And on this point, Peru reiterates this kind of tragedies. Our rejection of terrorism in all its manifestations, wherever it comes from. Fourthly, we demand an immediate and unconditional release of all persons deprived of their liberty and finding themselves as hostages. Fifth, firmly urging all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, and in particular regarding international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In this context, we have a strong commitment in favor of protecting the civilian population, humanitarian personnel, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian profit. Sixth, the approval of concrete